Aussie icon Dick Smith has labelled it a disaster for Aussie families. With immigration reaching record numbers, more migrants arrived in Australia in January than ever before. That's 125,000 permanent and long-term arrivals. The issues are well known. Housing crisis, anyone? Former New South Wales Premier Bob Carr famously announced Sydney was full back in the year 2000. Bob, many thanks for your time. Really appreciate your company. Clearly the powers that be, didn't listen to you.
I've been trying to get Australians to understand that we do not need to have the highest rate of immigration in proportion to our population in the world. There's no other country doing this. We've got third world rates of immigration and we don't need it. We don't need it. Australians, especially those in Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane, it's not a problem unique to Sydney. It's the two other cities experiencing the pressure even worse. I just wonder why this is the only economic model we've got to force feed population growth, to run the highest imaginable immigration intake, and to condemn our big cities to a relentless chase to keep up in terms of infrastructure. We don't have to do it to guarantee Australia's prosperity. In fact, it's a pretty lazy way of running an economy.
So who suffers the most here when this kind of immigration is occurring?
Well, it's very interesting. Studies of high immigration in the United Kingdom, it ran very high under Tony Blair and his successor Gordon Brown, and under David Cameron, the Conservative Prime Minister who replaced the Labor Prime Ministers. The studies confirmed there was no economic benefit conferred on the existing population. So you could say that those who moved to the UK and found jobs did well, but there was no benefit to the UK itself. There was no benefit to the existing population. And I suspect that similar studies would show that to be true here. If you run remorselessly high immigration decreed by bureaucrats in Canberra year on year, you're just making it harder for existing people, many of them migrants themselves, to get into home ownership or decent rentals. You're producing a housing crisis. The biggest factor in what can be called a housing crisis in Australia is the boost to demand for housing that's produced as a result of these ridiculously high immigration figures.
So is it just that the number of people coming in is too high, or is it that government and those charged with looking after this have not planned adequately enough?
Well, governments can't keep up. A former Liberal Premier of New South Wales, Dominic Perrottet, at a forum where he was sitting there with me talking about this, said it's simply impossible for state governments to keep up with the demand for new infrastructure caused by the high immigration that is Canberra's policy. And Canberra makes no contribution to the states in response to the pressure that it's putting the states under. So it's a mismatch between the figures that are carelessly settled on in Canberra, I think almost cavalierly invented in Canberra, and the pressures that land on state budgets. And residents can see in the increased congestion and the difficulty they have in getting decent rentals or buying into the housing market, what the increased demand, this artificially spiked demand, is doing to social justice in Australia. We don't need immigration to be this high.
If you were leader of the opposition, the federal opposition, I know that's very unlikely, but if you were Peter Dutton, how would you sell this to voters ahead of an election? What policy would you be promising regarding immigration?
Well, he'd need to craft a speech where he says something more than he thinks immigration should be lower rather than higher. So I would think he'd be seeking to impress the Australian people by talking serious figures, specific figures, based on the information he can get from serious consultancies and economists. And he'd also need to say something about how, if the federal government, with him as Prime Minister, went beyond those figures, there'd be a direct link to provide extra infrastructure assistance to the cities most affected, Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane. So for every additional, let's say 20,000 expected in one of those cities, the state would get funding for part of a new light rail system, or an extension of existing buses, or basic water and sewage infrastructure for new relief suburbs. And we've got to be honest, Canberra's got to say we're going to increase densities. You think of Canberra, the city which has got the lowest densities of any capital city in Australia, running immigration policies that are producing tower development everywhere you look, horizon to horizon, in Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane.
Bob Carr, thank you so much for your time.